Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? Yeah, can I have your attention, please? We are ready to, or shortly be ready to start the hearings. Please, could you check your mobile phones and any other electrical equipment you have with you are on silent mode. I have been asked about this this morning, but can I remind you that members of the public and media in the hearing room are not permitted to use any electronic devices during the hearing. If you wish to do this, you can do so in the annex. Legal representatives, please remember, though you can use such equipment in the hearing room, you may not transmit anything to the outside world until 10 minutes after it has been said or displayed. For those viewing in the annex, you will not receive any information until the 10-minute period has elapsed, so you may transmit information as soon as you see it. Can I also remind you that no food or drink may be consumed in the hearing room except for the water provided. Please wear your lanyards and passes at all times within the building, and note that if you leave the secure area of the building, these will need to be handed back. On re-entry, you will have to undergo a further security search, and time will be limited. Our ushers are here to help you, so please ask one of them if you have any questions. Some of the evidence to be heard in this inquiry may be upsetting. We do have volunteers from the Coroner's Court Support Service who are available for confidential discussions if anyone is affected by anything said or shown during these proceedings. We will be starting proceedings very shortly. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
So we have, of course, concluded hearing the evidence in these open sessions. And today the programme moves to you hearing oral closing submissions from core participants. The running order for those oral submissions will be, first of all, submissions from those representing the family, then from Operation Verbasco, then from Wiltshire Police, then from SWAFT, and then those representing the Scripples, and finally those representing His Majesty's government. We have had some time estimates provided, of which I know you're aware, and we are confident, sir, that assuming those time estimates are complied with, we will finish before the end of the today, probably sometime in mid-afternoon.
Well, if I may say so, it's extremely helpful of people to have provided what I'm sure are reliable time estimates. It enables all of us to work out how the day will work. But that's my hope as well.
So, yes. Looking just a little further ahead, you have directed that core participants should provide detailed written submissions by the 20th of December. And when those written submissions have been provided to the inquiry, the intention is they will be published on the inquiry website.
Yes.
So that, of course, the public have an opportunity to see them too. So there's one other procedural matter to mention, and that is the question of documents being adduced into evidence. You, of course, sir, have adduced a large number of documents or parts of documents into evidence as we have gone through the evidence. And as you have adduced them, they have then been published on the inquiry website. There is now a sort of catching up exercise to undertake. We are conscious that there are probably quite a large number of documents that you will require to be in evidence to consider for the purposes of drafting your report.
Yeah.
We are in the process of putting together a list of the documents which we will invite you to adduce into evidence for that purpose. There are one or two documents within that category that have not been looked at all so far. For example, we have recently received a further statement from Kerry Laws, which has not been considered in evidence and which we will invite you to adduce. But just to be clear, the vast majority of the list that we will provide will be documents where parts of that document have already been adduced into evidence, but we will be suggesting to you that you in fact adduce the entirety of the document.
Yes, if I've been asked to look at part of a document, I need to see the context.
went past 47 Christie Miller Road 4 times, other than to prepare to put Novichok on the front door handle. Secondly, similarly, the two men were given an opportunity to answer the case against them in an interview with Russia Today on the 13th of September 2018. Their account of what they did in Salisbury is plainly false in a number of respects, as explained at paragraphs 46 to 48 of our submissions. For example, they said they went to Salisbury for tourism or sightseeing. There's nothing whatsoever of any touristic or sightseeing interest in the 4 journeys they took, marked in yellow on the graphics pack, to the vicinity of 47 Christie Miller Road. Thirdly, the Nina Ricci bottle was specially adapted, post-manufacture, so that it would be suitable to carry Novichok across a border without detection and to apply the Novichok to a door handle. Fourthly, counter-terrorism police are in possession of evidence that the real identities of Petrov, Bosharov and Fedotov were Alexander Mishkin, Anatoly Chapiga and Denis Sergeyev, respectively, and that all 3 worked for the GRU Unit 29155. Open aspects of this evidence were set out on the 20th of November 2024 by Commander Murphy and also appear in the police report. We do not repeat any of that excellent analysis here, but invite you, of course, to examine it carefully in the context of the closed evidence. So I'm moving from factors that are more focused on Petrov and Bosharov to factors that are focused on the broader Russian state.
Right.
But in my submission, all of these factors should be taken cumulatively. Taken together, they provide a compelling case against both Petrov and Bosharov, and also against other Russian officials that were culpable for the Skripal attack. So the next point is the Novichok. The Novichok used in this case came from the Russian state. Both DSTL and the OPCW concluded that the Novichok used here was at a very high level of purity. MK26 explained that this was important as it indicates that whoever made this specific Novichok was very sophisticated. MK26 and a number of other authoritative sources have explained that a non-state actor could not make and deploy Novichok of this high level of purity. Indeed, it wasn't any state that could access this Novichok. EU regulations placing sanctions on Russian officials in connection with the poisoning of Mr. Navalny stated that the Novichok is accessible only to the state authorities in the Russian Federation. Mr. Allen confirmed that the UK government shares that assessment. There's open evidence that Russia has produced Novichok for a number of years, including evidence from scientists and others who were involved in the Russian Novichok program. Ms. Sagar and Mr. Allen confirmed in evidence that the Russian state continued to develop and produce Novichok after the Chemical Weapons Convention came into effect in Russia. Russia's Novichok program remained covert and contrary to its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Ms. Sagar and Sir Mark Sedwell explained that Russia produced and stockpiled Novichok in the decade leading up to 2018, and that in 2018 itself, Russia held stocks of Novichok intended for use as a chemical weapon. The Russian state then used Novichok in an attempted murder of Mr. Navalny in 2020, which is further evidence of their possession of and propensity to use Novichok as a tool of assassination. The UK government has also said that Russia developed Novichok to prevent detection by the West and circumvent international chemical weapons controls, that Russia did so for the purpose of using Novichok in assassination attempts, that it trained special agents in doing this, and that one of the ways in which they were trained to do so was by applying Novichok to door handles. We anticipate that there will be closed evidence to support all of those assertions, but assuming they're correct, then they provide striking support for the contention that the Novichok left on the door handle of Mr. Skripal's house was put there by a Russian agent. The next factor, sir, is motive. The Russian state, and Mr. Putin in particular, had at least one motive to attack Mr. Skripal. The primary motive was that the Russian state believed that Mr. Skripal was providing evidence against Russian interests to Western intelligence services. Commenting on the Skripal attack after the event, Mr. Putin called Mr. Skripal a traitor and said he left and continued cooperating he consulted some special services. This indicates that Mr. Putin considered that even after the 2010 spy swap, Mr. Skripal continued to provide information to intelligence services. So whether or not Mr. Putin retained a grudge against Mr. Skripal for his pre-2006 activities, notwithstanding the spy swap, there was a new motive. Mr. Skripal had re-entered the game. Linked or other motives were identified by Mr. Skripal himself. Two of them were that, first, Mr. Skripal knows a lot of Russian top secrets that are really dangerous for the Russian special services. Another potential motive identified by Mr. Skripal was that he had evidence that Mr. Putin embezzled hundreds of millions of dollars from the Russian people, stealing money which was intended to be used to buy food for the hungry St. Petersburg population. Mr. Putin has made comments which indicate an intent to harm Mr. Skripal. These come in the context, of course, of a disinformation tactic of conflicting narratives. But Mr. Putin has described Mr. Skripal as a traitor, even after he was pardoned. So shortly after the 2010 spy swap, Mr. Putin said, "As for the traitors, they will croak all by themselves." It appears that he was referring to Mr. Skripal alongside a former Russian intelligence officer when he said the traitors. Similarly, after the Salisbury incident, Mr. Putin said Mr. Skripal was a traitor to his motherland. This was a telling and ominous description. Mr. Putin has himself made comments indicating that he considers traitors should be killed, and the Russian state under Mr. Putin has a proven record of trying to kill those it considers traitors, including by the use of unusual poisons. To pick a few examples, the Russian state attempted to murder Mr. Navalny in 2020 using Novichok. Secondly, the chairman of the Litvinenko inquiry concluded that Mr. Litvinenko was murdered using polonium, and the operation was probably approved by Mr. Putin. Third, the Czech government concluded that Petrov and Bosharov themselves were responsible for an explosion at an ammunition storage in the Czech Republic on the 16th of October 2014, which killed 2 people. The UK government was briefed about this and accepted the Czech conclusion. And fourthly, sir, the Intelligence and Security Committee's Russia report indicates that the classified annex of the report makes finding about the vulnerability of former Russian intelligence officers who've settled in the UK, and you may wish to examine those findings. This proven record of attempted assassinations is also similar fact evidence, evidence of propensity. In our submission, it makes it more likely that the Russian state attempted to assassinate Mr. Skripal. The next factor is that Mr. Putin and his close allies have given false or inculpatory statements about this case. Similarly, the Russian intelligence services have attempted to interfere with evidence about it. It's open to you, sir, from those 2 facts to draw an inference that the Russian state was responsible. So as to the disinformation, a deluge of conflicting and at times preposterous accounts have been put forward by the Russian state. They've included that the Skripal attack was brought about by Yulia's mother-in-law, by Theresa May, as a distraction from Brexit, or as a means of increasing military spending. As both the Prime Minister and Mr. Allen put it, the disinformation further demonstrates the Russian state's culpability. More specifically, on about the 20th of March 2018, Mr. Putin denied that the Russian state was behind the Skripal attack on the basis that, in quotes, the Skripals would have died on the spot if they were targeted by a military-grade nerve agent, of which Russia had none. That was false for 2 reasons. Firstly, Russia did have a military-grade nerve agent, and Mr. Putin would plainly have known that. Secondly, the examples of everyone contaminated by Novichok in this case, as well as Mr. Navalny, show that it's false to say that Mr. Skripal would have died on the spot if he'd been targeted by a military-grade nerve agent. On the 12th of September 2018, 7 days after the Prime Minister announced that Petrov and Bosharov were GRU agents using false identities, Mr. Putin said, on television, of course, we looked who these people are. We know who they are. Of course, they are civilians. That too was a lie. The men were not civilians, they were GRU agents, and Mr. Putin would plainly have known that that was false. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was a close ally of Mr. Putin, said Russia had completely destroyed chemical arms in the context of this incident. Again, that was knowingly false. Mr. Lavrov also claimed at one point that the toxin in the Skripal samples had been identified as a chemical name as BZ, and at another point he claimed that the toxin had never been found in Russian nerve agents. Again, both claims were demonstrably false. As to the interference with evidence, the Russian intelligence services attempted to interfere with evidence in this case in two ways. In April 2018, GRU officers were found attempting to hack into the OPCW in The Hague at the time when the OPCW was examining the Novichok used in Salisbury. Secondly, the ISC, the Intelligence Security Committee Russia report, noted that GRU actors tried to hack into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and DSTL during the early stages of the investigation into the Salisbury attacks. And as I say, sir, we invite you to draw inferences from that disinformation and the interference with the evidence as to culpability. So at 95 to 101 of our submissions, we deal with the assessments that have been made by the UK government and by other governments, and the question as to what weight should be given to those assessments. There's further evidence that Mr. Putin was responsible for the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal. The evidence includes the following, much of which was covered by Mr. Allen. Firstly, at least 3 separate units within the GRU carried out operations in connection with the Skripals, and this indicates coordination at a high level. Secondly, the Russian state is highly bureaucratic. This operation had far-reaching geopolitical risks, which means it could not have been carried out without Mr. Putin's authorization. That's consistent with Mr. Skripal's own view. He said, I believe Putin makes all important decisions himself. I therefore think that he must have at least given permission for the attack on Yulia and me. Any GRU commander taking a decision like this without Putin's permission would have been severely punished. Mr. Allen confirmed that Mr. Skripal was extremely well placed to know this, given his lengthy service in senior positions in the GRU. The third factor pointing towards Mr. Putin's responsibility is that Russian law states that special operations may be deployed against a terrorist with the approval of the president. As Mr. Allen confirmed, that by analogy, this indicates that the present operation is also likely to require presidential approval. And similarly, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services recently said the general management of the Foreign Intelligence Services, and the GRU is one of those foreign intelligence agencies, is carried out by the president of the Russian Federation. And so all of this points to ultimate responsibility of this type of attack being held by Mr. Putin. So I'd like to move on from the Skripals to Dawn's death. We invite you to come to certain conclusions specifically about Dawn's death, which include the following. Firstly, the Novichok which killed Dawn was intentionally left in the UK by Petrov and Bosharov on the weekend of the 2nd to 4th March 2018. Secondly, the operation to deposit Novichok in the UK was brought about by other Russian officials, including Mr. Putin. Thirdly, this was obviously extremely dangerous. Fourth, it caused Dawn's death. And finally, so we invite you to conclude that this was an unlawful killing. The evidence to support those conclusions is set out in our written submissions at paragraph 106 to 129, and I'll summarise it just briefly now. Dawn was killed as a result of being contaminated by the specific Novichok from the Nina Ricci bottle. That's clear from the evidence of MK26, the OPCW, and Professor Rutty. The reasons for their conclusions include, first, the specific Novichok found in the bottle was also found in all of the samples collected from Dawn. That's perhaps the key factor. Second, by far the highest level of Novichok was found inside the bottle, much higher than anywhere else. And third, the specific Novichok that killed Dawn was also found on Dawn and Charlie, on their clothes, and items that they touched in a pattern which was consistent with Charlie's account as to how Dawn was poisoned. To take a few examples, there were high levels of Novichok on Dawn's hands. There were medium to high levels on Charlie's hands, the white soap dispenser, the tap, the sink, the plug hole, and on Charlie's jeans. Moving on in time, there were lower levels on the transit van that Charlie travelled in later on the 30th of June. Further, the Novichok trace evidence shows that Dawn and Charlie were not contaminated before they arrived at 9 Muggleton Road late in the evening of 29th June 2018. For example, CCTV on the door of the Cedar Room makes clear that Dawn and Charlie spent considerable periods of time in that room on the afternoon and evening of the 29th of June. The room was sampled extensively and no Novichok was found in there. Similarly, the bus that they took on the evening of the 29th of June, shortly after 10 p.m, was sampled and was negative for Novichok. That indicated that Dawn and Charlie were not contaminated at the time they were in the Cedar Room or when they took the bus. So the specific Novichok that killed Dawn must have been left in the UK by Petrov and Bosharov on the weekend of the 2nd to 4th of March 2018. We respectfully submit that the following 5 facts make that clear. And first, the Novichok in the Nina Ricci bottle and that used to poison the Skripals were not only identical, they were from the same batch, from the same precursor chemicals, produced at the same time. Second, it's highly difficult and dangerous to produce, handle and transport Novichok. That's in part for practical reasons and in part due to stringent Chemical Weapons Convention controls. In addition, there would be inevitable far-reaching diplomatic consequences of sending Novichok to the UK, which means that bringing it to the UK would be a highly complex and dangerous exercise. Thirdly, this was unique. Novichok has never been brought to the UK or used in the UK before or since this incident. The fourth factor is proximity in time and space. So the Nina Ricci bottle was found in the same area as the Skripal poisoning shortly afterwards. And finally, there's no suggestion whatsoever that the Novichok was brought to the UK on a different occasion by different people for a different purpose. And that's important in the context of the complexity of an operation of this nature and the fact that there's significant information available about the planning and execution of the Skripal attack. So in consequence, we say that there can be no real doubt that the Novichok which poisoned Dawn was left in the UK by Petrov and Bosharov. There's no realistic alternative explanation. A different question is whether the bottle itself, which Charlie found, was the same bottle as that which applied the Novichok to the front door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road. That is, was there one bottle or two? So far as culpability for Dawn's death is concerned, that question does not appear to be material. The key issue is whether the Novichok itself that killed Dawn was left by Petrov and Bosharov. It doesn't matter if they left one bottle or two bottles. So disposing of the bottle of Novichok in the UK, disguised as a perfume bottle, in a place where it could be recovered, was obviously an extremely dangerous act. MK26 confirmed that the bottle contained enough Novichok to kill or poison many thousands of people. One person did in fact die, several were seriously ill, and a total of 87 members of the public presented to the hospital emergency department as a result of this, the Novichok. I'd like to turn to the issue of unlawful killing. So the legal reasons why we submit that a conclusion of unlawful killing may be left at this inquiry are at paragraphs 130 to 131 of our submissions. In short, a conclusion of unlawful killing in this case would not, we say, infringe the prohibition in Section 2 of the Inquiries Act of a determination of any person's civil or criminal liability. So there are two real reasons for that. Firstly, unlawful killing doesn't determine a specific criminal offence. And secondly, it doesn't determine a person's criminal liability, since it doesn't identify a person as being responsible.
But you invite me to say who was responsible, don't you?
Well, so we invite you to identify, so far as possible, who is responsible for the matters here, but we don't invite you to say an individual committed a specific criminal offence.
I see.
And a number of inquiries have left an unlawful killing conclusion, but when it's left, it's not left as in X committed a criminal offence Y. It's merely left this was an unlawful killing.
I see.
So that the criminal offence and the person responsible for it remain ambiguous. And so we say there's case law from the inquest context, which is a similar, not identical, but a similar statutory provision which supports that. So an unlawful killing conclusion may be left if an inquiry chair decides that the death was a result of one or more of the homicide offences. And we say that the elements of unlawful act manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter are met here. That's for the reasons in paragraphs 135 to 136 of our submissions. So for the purpose of finding facts relevant to whether this was an unlawful killing, it doesn't appear to be necessary to determine exactly how the Novichok got from the front door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road to 9 Muggleton Road a few months later. The facts that Novichok was recklessly left in the Salisbury area, that Charlie subsequently discovered it, and this caused Dawn's death, are sufficient, we say, at least so far as culpability is concerned. However, so far as it is relevant, there are a number of possibilities as to how the Novichok got to Charlie, which are discussed at paragraphs 137 to 141 of our submissions. For example, in the 33-minute period that Petrov and Bosharov were off camera on the 4th of March, they may have gone to the Queen Elizabeth Gardens, disassembled the device, sealed it in wrappers and in the box, and then put it somewhere in the Salisbury area. The Nina Ritchie box could have been found subsequently by a member of the public, stored somewhere for a time. For example, it may have been donated to one of the many charity shops on the same short stretch of Catherine Street as Cancer Research. It could have been taken into a pub or a commercial premises, residential property, and stored there for a time. After being stored, for one reason or another, it could have been disposed of in the Brown Street car park bins, which are accessible to any member of the public at any time, shortly before Charlie found it in the week of the 26th of June 2018. Another possible option is that Charlie recovered the Novichok from the Brown Street car park bins on the 4th of March 2018. However, it seems to the family most unlikely that, having intentionally picked up the box, Charlie would then not either have given it to Dawn or tried to sell it for nearly 4 months. He must have been aware of it during that period, not least because he moved property on the 18th of May 2018. Dawn's birthday was the 18th of June, which was an obvious moment to give it to her as a present. So, in conclusion, the government announced at an early stage its view that the Russian state was responsible for this matter. But despite this, a fully reasoned conclusion from an independent inquiry chair, which specifically identifies the senior officials who were responsible, is of far-reaching importance. It would be an authoritative statement on the historical record, the best way to correct disinformation inside Russia and beyond, and the closest that the family can get to public accountability. So I'll hand over to Mr. Nichols for the next.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Straw. It's helpful. Just give me a second, Mr. Nichols.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
So, good morning. I'm going to set out the family's closing submissions on the emergency and public health responses to the poisonings,
Yes.
focusing on 3 core areas. First, the response to the Skripal poisoning in March 2018, and the adequacy, or otherwise, of what was done. Second, the UK authorities' response to Dawn and Charlie's poisoning on the 30th of June 2018. And third, I will set out the family's concerns about some important deficiencies in the steps that have followed Dawn's death. Before moving, sir, to the substance of my submissions, may I set out some brief headlines? This area of the evidence is of real and considerable importance to Dawn's family, That is for a number of reasons, which include, first, some aspects of the response were, in their view, highly commendable. The family feel very strongly that that should be recognised where praise is due. Second, other aspects of the response failed the family badly, causing them significant pain and leaving lasting damage. The family feel equally strongly that such failures should be recognised where that is due. Third, it matters a great deal to the family that Dawn's death was not in vain, and that if there is an opportunity for improvements to be made, such improvements should be made. The evidence they have heard has shone a light on a number of areas where the response fell short and where they consider there is scope for improvement. Given its importance to the family, they have understandably paid close attention to the evidence in this area, and having done so, sir, in headline terms, they invite you to reach the following conclusions. First, following the Skripal poisoning, there was a failure by the TMO and Public Health England to issue do not pick it up advice to the public. That advice should have been issued. Second, following the Skripal poisoning, first responders were not informed of the risk that discarded Novichok may have remained present in the community. They should have been. They were also not provided with adequate steps to ensure that they, first responders, were properly aware of the signs, symptoms, and key differential diagnosis of nerve agent poisoning.
Yeah.
As a result of those two factors, the preparation for a potential secondary incident was wanting. Third, there was a lack of effective debrief and learning following the Salisbury attack at both a national and local level. I'll come on to explain why, and I hope, sir, that you've seen the document that we provided which sets out some of the detail. Mm-hmm. Fourth, the response of the paramedics to Dawn and Charlie's collapse was commendable and should be recognised publicly. The family have asked me to thank the ambulance staff for their efforts to help Dawn and Charlie. They, the paramedics, acted with great professionalism and care, and the family are grateful. The family also wish to thank staff at Salisbury District Hospital for their efforts to help and care for Dawn. In stark contrast, the response of Wiltshire Police was severely inadequate. The family have listened to the evidence, and they consider that the police's response was blighted by arrogance, stereotyping, and a lack of professionalism. Multiple Wiltshire police officers dismissed the clear and correct assessment from qualified paramedics who identified that Charlie was suffering from nerve agent poisoning. In acting in that way, they put other first responders and the public at grave risk, and their actions could have cost Dawn and Charlie their lives. Officers' failings were then compounded by a serious failure to provide Dawn's doctors with accurate information. The police response has caused unjustified and lasting damage to Dawn, her reputation, and to her family. And the family invite you, sir, to record publicly Wiltshire Police's failings and to set the record straight once and for all. Finally, by way of headline, the family consider there have been a number of deficiencies in the learning and changes that followed Dawn's poisoning. They consider that in this area there is scope for important recommendations to be made. Having summarised those headline points, I will address each in a little more detail.
Right.
First, the failure to issue do not pick up advice before the 30th of June 2018. We respectfully submit, sir, that following the Skripal poisoning, the risk was recognised that Novichok may have been discarded in the community, posing an ongoing and severe risk to public safety. This risk was identified and considered by numerous relevant individuals and organisations, including the following. The Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davis, identified this risk as early as March 2018. She raised it in meetings with officials. She described it in evidence to you, sir, as a serious risk, and Professor Sir John Aston, the Home Office's Chief Scientific Advisor, recalls Dame Sally raising this concern at SAGE meetings on either the 9th or 16th of March. SAGE recognised the risk that Novichok may have been discarded as early as the 9th of March. Sir John gave evidence confirming that SAGE actively considered this possibility, that is to say, a discarded container of Novichok in the community, as well as other forms of undiscovered Novichok, for example, it being placed elsewhere deliberately. From an early stage, the police investigation identified the risk that a container of Novichok may have been discarded in the local area. That concern was shared with PHE as early as the 9th of March. You'll recall the minutes that were shown to you many, many times with the quote, sites for discarded unused substance. Based on the police's information, PHE recognised as early as the 9th of March that the possibility of a discarded container posed an ongoing risk to public health. Again, you will recall the same minutes which contain the quote, what we are moving towards is to relay messages to the public around not picking up any unidentified containers. PHE's own identification of the risk from a discarded container was shared with the police at an early stage in the investigation. You have seen a document prepared by Dr. Nick Gent referring to a meeting at which he, V13A, and a senior officer from CTP met, and PHE were briefed that, quote, it was foreseeable, that is to say, from PHE's perspective, that residual materials discarded by the perpetrators could be discovered and cause acute clinical harm to those persons finding them. That was, tragically, highly prescient. V13A confirmed in evidence that the possibility of a discarded container was identified, discussed, and documented by PHE at an early stage, who recognised it as a potential risk, V13A's own words in their witness statement. The list of those who identified the risk of discarded Novichok also included central government. The DHSE considered the risk of such a discarded container leading to a secondary incident. You are very familiar, sir, with the RWCS, Reasonable Worst Case Scenario document, which identified the risk of a secondary incident through, quote, the accidental discovery of discarded agent by humans. And the heading of that document was entitled Salisbury Nerve Agent Attack, risk of secondary incident. The DHSE in that document identified as one of the, quote, key questions for consequence management this question: what information should be given to the public? We say that was a vital question that required an answer. We also say that it is very likely that PHE were made aware of the concerns about discarded Novichok through other information sharing arrangements. For example, V13A, a senior official at PHE, attended numerous SRG meetings and was tasked from the first stages with ensuring that information from the police was fed into PHE. Indeed, V13A held meetings specifically to, quote, maximise the inflow of information into PHE in order to, quote, support public health management. Similarly, it is very likely that PHE were made aware of the department's concerns about discarded Novichok through another ciphered witness, D84U. D84U was a senior official within the Department of Health who worked closely with V13A, and D84U was tasked on the 8th of March with acting as a liaison between the CCS, that is to say, Civil Contingency Secretariat at the Cabinet Office, and the PHE SRG. D84U had explicit responsibility for feeding back information from the CCS to the SRG. That's in one of the documents, and the action coursed throughout the SRG minutes until that group was disbanded. As you recall, sir, D84U was interviewed as part of a lessons learned review by another individual with an alphabet soup name, L55F. D84U said this in that interview, quote, "The possibility was considered that other caches of the agent could be present, for example, in a discarded bottle." The risk of discarded Novichok, finally, was reflected in the police's searches during March and into April 2018. This is significant because PHE were aware on the 29th of March that the police were searching for, quote, disposed chemical waste. Dame Sally herself was told that, quote, the police were hunting for a discarded vial as early as March 2018. Neither PHE nor Dame Sally were informed that the police searches had identified discarded Novichok. They hadn't. Nor were they told that the risk from such discard had therefore been removed. It follows that the severe risk remained. Given that risk and its severity, and the range of those who had recognised it from an early stage, we say two questions arise. Should Do Not Pick It Up advice have been issued before July, when it was first issued, and who was responsible for that delay, as we characterise it? On the question of responsibility, the evidence is clear. That lay with the CMO and PHE, both of whom confirmed they were responsible for issuing public health advice. As to the second question, whether that advice should have been issued, the family respectfully invite you, sir, to conclude that it should have been, for in summary, the following reasons. First, there was a risk the container of Novichok had been discarded. Second, the risk to the public posed by that container was exceptionally grave. Third, the likely form of the container had been considered, with a bottle or vial being identified prior to the 30th of June. Fourth, the evidence indicates that Do Not Pick It Up advice was feasible and would have been beneficial. It is, we say, significant that such advice was actively considered by PHE as early as the 9th of March, with no concerns raised about feasibility or impact. The advice was subsequently issued in July with no concerns raised, either before its issue or afterwards, based on the documents.
Not in July.
As Dame Sally stated in her evidence, quote, all the evidence about communicating about science risk and medical emergencies shows that you get the best out of the public if you tell them the truth about what's happening. Given the balance of risks, potential death versus, at best, the possible anxiety that V13A referred to, Do Not Pick It Up advice should have been issued. It is telling, we say, that Dame Sally's evidence is that such advice was issued before the 30th of June because such advice was necessary to protect the public, while the advice, we say, plainly was not issued until after dawn was poisoned. The fact that Dame Sally considers it should have been, we say, strongly indicates that it should have been issued. It's similarly telling that V13A stated that when Do Not Pick It Up advice was issued in July, that was, quote, a proportionate way to reassure the public. There was no evidence to indicate that that was not also true prior to the 30th of June in our submission. As a result of the failure to issue that advice before the 30th of June, the public were placed at considerable risk, and Dawn was denied the possibility of a different outcome for these reasons. Had she known that the authorities advised against picking up such items because they might pose a fatal risk linked to a nerve agent poisoning, she could have been more careful. Similarly, her family members could have warned her. Both she and they were denied that opportunity. Moving to the next topic, provision of information to first responders following the Skripal attack. Following that attack, frontline responders were not informed of the risk of Novichok being discarded in the community. We say they should have been, so that they could make informed risk assessments and so they could assess on the ground whether signs and symptoms were caused by a secondary incident. The need to provide such first responders and healthcare staff with adequate knowledge was recognised in the Department for Health's reasonable worst case scenario document. You'll recall, sir, that the document included the following passage, quote, "Learning from the 4th of March should be rapidly disseminated to ensure effective and safe first response." We say that was not done. For example, following the Skripal attack, police officers were not provided with training or guidance on the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning. The only relevant document circulated at a police level following the attack on the Skripals was wrongly restricted to CBRN specialists. You heard from Commander Murphy on a number of occasions during his visits about the fact that the classification marking on that did not need to apply, but restricted recipients. The PHE documents created following the Skripal poisoning were, we suggest, lacking. You may recall brief questions that I asked of the experts Nolan and Saw in this respect. The documents from PHE pre-Dawn's poisoning did not identify the important role of excessive salivation and secretions in a nerve agent poisoning, distinct from an opiate overdose, nor did those documents identify the most important differential diagnosis, in a nerve agent case, an opiate overdose.
Really?
The important differential diagnosis is an opiate overdose. After Dawn's death, PHE issued a document which expressly recognised that differential diagnosis and how to distinguish it. Before, they did not.
And it's excessive salivation and secretions, which is the key, is it, according to you say?
In relation to the differential diagnosis, that's one of the key indicators, and there is a specific treatment with naloxone,
Yep.
phased and repeated, that's identified in the later PHE document that was only issued after Dawn had died.
Okay.
Next topic, sir, debriefs and learning following the Skripal poisoning. At both a national and local level, the processes that followed the Skripal poisoning did not, we suggest, provide the prompt and effective preparedness for a secondary incident that was required. At the national level, the DHSE reasonable worst case scenario document considered a secondary incident, as you know, as early as the 15th of March. It was described as, quote, a first stab. It appears to have been designed for discussion and development with at least PHE and NHS England. It's notable that the consequent management section of the document contains a number of areas where action is required and the document is blank. The covering email, in which it was circulated to D84U, states, quote, "It might be useful to get PHE and NHS England to consider some of the key questions and confirm that appropriate plans and capacity are in place." There is no evidence that the document was ever circulated outside the department, no evidence that it was developed further, and no evidence that the actions were picked up in order to prepare for a secondary incident. It seems that that reasonable worst case scenario was identified, rightly, and then essentially forgotten. National clinical learning from the Skripal attack focused around the 19th of April discussion at Porton Down that you've heard about. One of the objectives of that meeting was to identify what learning should be shared, quote, in case this happens again. The discussion at Porton Down did identify the risk of diagnosing nerve agent poisoning as a drug overdose. Indeed, that gave rise to Learning Point 1 in the report. But the report was not circulated until the 9th of July, the day after Dawn died. At a local level, sir, we suggest there were similar missed opportunities. We've set them out in the written document. They will be reflected in the written submissions, and I don't dwell on them now. Can I move on, please, to the response to Dawn and Charlie's poisoning?
Please.
As I said in my headline comments, family consider that the paramedics who responded should be publicly recognised. In particular, they wish to publicly thank Ben Channon and Lee Martin. They consider that their conduct was exemplary and may have saved Charlie's life. It was all the more impressive that they maintained their professionalism given the police's dismissive and unprofessional response. By contrast, sir, the family invite you to find that the police's response was severely inadequate and contained the following, among other failings. First, on arriving at 9 Muggleton Road, both P.S. McCurley and Inspector Beresford-Smith breached the cordon, ignoring clear instructions and posing a risk to public safety, as well as a risk to themselves. Sergeant McCurley entered 9 Muggleton Road, despite being told that the paramedics inside considered they were dealing with a nerve agent incident. When asked to leave, he refused, and in doing so, he put the public at grave risk. Sergeant McCurley, Wiltshire Police's FIM, the Force Incident Manager, not at scene, and Inspector Beresford-Smith all refused to follow the medical assessment from multiple qualified paramedics, including one who had been at the Skripal poisoning, that Charlie, was Mr. Parsons.
That's Parsons, yes.
That Charlie was suffering from nerve agent poisoning. In effect, we say, sir, the officers thought they knew better. They were wrong, and their conduct was highly unprofessional and dismissive. Fourth, while at 9 Muggleton Road, Sergeant McCurley spoke with DS Laws, who was at the hospital. Sergeant McCurley knew when he did that the paramedics had assessed that Charlie was suffering from nerve agent poisoning. Despite that knowledge, he did not ask Sergeant Laws to pass that vital information to Dawn's doctors in order to assist their assessment and treatment of Dawn. That was a serious failure he should have done. Back to scene, Inspector Beresford-Smith stood down the scene at 9 Muggleton Road. You asked him, sir, a direct question about who was responsible for that decision. It was a unilateral decision made by him over the heads of the other 2 blue light services at the scene. Sixth point, the police's approach was in breach of the Jessup principles. Seventh, turning to the hospital, DS Laws attended at around 7:45. She informed Dr. Jukes that the police had intelligence of drug use at the property where Dawn had collapsed. She also requested that intelligence checks be conducted on Dawn. Dawn's entry on the police national computer showed that she had no convictions, cautions, or reprimands for any offence, including drugs offences, and that was known that night within minutes.
Yes, the various assertions that she had were clearly wrong, and you would put it rather a good deal more strongly than that.
I would, sir.
But of course, the absence of conviction only takes you so far, doesn't it?
It takes you only so far, but we say, sir, it takes you somewhere.
Yep.
And it's important, as DS Laws has herself recognised in the statement that was disclosed on Friday, that such information should have been provided to the doctors, and she has apologised for the failure to do so.
Quite.
Final point in relation to the hospital and the police's role, sir. Dr. Russell confirmed in his evidence that police officers told doctors at the hospital that Dawn was an intravenous drug user. That was reflected in Charlie's medical notes referring to Dawn. As late as the 4th of July, days later, DS Martin still described Dawn to numerous other professionals in an important response meeting as a, quote, known drug user. That was wrong. It was inconsistent with the PNC and Wiltshire Police's own intelligence and information, and was said at a time when DS Martin accepted that she personally knew that Dawn was not a drug user. That, the family consider, is unacceptable, and that should be recorded. In our submission, sir, this catalogue of deficiencies cannot be explained as individual oversight or mere error of judgment. The family have followed this evidence closely. For them, the police's failings in this case reveal a cultural and attitudinal problem. The officers were high-handed and dismissive. They worked in stereotypes, and they were blinkered by a singular and incorrect focus on drug use. And their hurtful and erroneous characterisation of Dawn was based on a selective approach to the information that they held, which they then shared with doctors. These are matters of very serious concern, and the family say, sir, that it is telling and regrettable that while a corporate apology has been issued, none of the frontline officers accepted their own failings and apologised until very late in the day, if at all. Moving to the final topic, learning and changes following Dawn's poisoning. The family have heard many references to lessons being learned. But on a number of important issues, it appears that key lessons still have not been learned. To take one example, it is a matter of considerable concern for Dawn's family that numerous Wiltshire Police witnesses stated they were unaware of any form of internal reflective learning process within the force. When asked, Inspector Beresford Smith said that he had learned no lessons from the response to Dawn's collapse. The family are concerned that that attitude means there is a real risk that the core failure in this case will be repeated. And for them, the core failure is obvious. It's that the officers unilaterally dismissed a medical assessment from paramedics. One family member summarised it in this way to me, sir: the police just did not listen. The evidence heard by the inquiry has not provided the necessary confidence that that concern has been remedied. Mr. Faulkner, your expert witness, sir, stated that matters of medical assessment are for the ambulance service. Yet none of the Wiltshire police officer witnesses who gave evidence articulated that understanding. And when asked about how these failings on the 30th of June would be prevented in future, many witnesses simply said, we would rely on the Jessup principles. But the Jessup principles were in place at the time and were breached. In those circumstances, the family, sir, invite you to make recommendations on this important issue. At a national level, the learning also reveals important concerns. I'll give just one example and briefly. We say do not pick up advice should have been issued before Dawn's poisoning, and it was not. Sir John Aston, as you will recall, sir, was tasked with conducting a review following Dawn's poisoning. One of its core requirements was to assess, quote, whether the initial public health advice following the Skripal poisoning had been correct. Sir John appeared to accept in his evidence that his credentials for conducting that review were somewhat limited. He wasn't a public health professional, but he had to perform the review because it needed to be done at speed, and others with those qualifications in public health were not available to perform the task. He concluded that there was, quote, nothing to imply that the public health advice had been inappropriate. Well, sir, we say, for the reasons I set out earlier, that conclusion was wrong, because do not pick it up advice should have been issued and wasn't. And there does not appear to have been any effective consideration of why the failure to issue do not pick it up advice occurred in order to learn for future public health messaging so that doesn't happen again. If I can turn finally to very brief concluding observations. We say, sir, that the conclusions we invite you to make will serve important purposes. First, they will provide Dawn's family with an informed, clear understanding of the circumstances of her death and a public record of those matters. Second, there is a strong public interest in identifying failings that the inquiry has exposed for reasons that I will not labour. Third, you've heard all the evidence and considered the issues in detail. We say it would squander that thorough and important work and run counter to the inquiry's purposes were findings on the central issues to be withheld. And finally, sir, the family considered that it is, sadly, a likelihood, or at least possibility, that CBRN attacks of a similar nature may occur in future. Sadly, the past provides a warning to that effect. Such attacks will, if they occur, by their nature, be unusual, deploying unexpected chemicals to kill and maim. But the fact that such incidents will be rare is the reason why public health and first responders must be prepared and enabled to respond effectively. We say that is essential to save lives in future, and this inquiry's report is an opportunity to aid that preparation which should be seized. The family believe that Dawn and they, sir, are entitled to that much, and they ask for that. And so those are our submissions on this point.
Mr. Nichols, I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
We'll break, I think, please, now until 11:30, and we'll take you then, Mr. Mansfield, if that's convenient. 11:30. Mansfield.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
It may be a relief to know I'm not going to read the submission that I've put in, which is really a set of notes. The right notes, possibly in the wrong order, but that's why I'm reorganising and distilling the main points.
You take your own course, Mr.
Yes,
Mansfield.
I'm much obliged. You heard some extremely important evidence on Friday. I'm not saying other days there was not, but it's extremely important last week. Because Jonathan Allen, the last witness, who had a very important role to play early on, and he was one of the first spokespeople on behalf of the government on the 14th of March 2018, on the very same day as the Prime Minister was speaking. She had spoken on the 12th of March as well. The importance of what he said is in his statement as well, but he made one, I would suggest to you, kernel point for these proceedings, and in the context of the issue I wish to address you upon today, which is preventability. And he said that he indicated what the first duty of government, the United Kingdom government, was.
Yeah.
Now, it may have been platitudinous, but it's nevertheless extremely important, as you will recognise. And he said the first duty of the United Kingdom government, and the one that obviously he was abiding by, was to protect the national security of its citizens. Now, we say at this stage, although my submission is more prospective rather than retrospective as the two previous, we say there's been in this instance an abject failure by the United Kingdom government to protect the United Kingdom public. Necessarily and naturally, we focused a lot on the Skripals, and I don't wish to detract from the very serious situation, the anguish in which, and the pain they have been through. However, what tends to get, well, I don't say forgotten, but perhaps provided with a second place, is the public in the matter of all of this. Because there was a public risk, there is a public risk. And it's interesting that in Caroline Sturgess's statement, which you have, one of the points she makes towards the end of it is that, in a sense, they're fortunate that it was only dawn. Interesting, the family, in a generous spirit, recognise that we're all lucky, and that's the phrase, we're lucky. No more people ended up dead. And we're dealing with thousands, as has already been mentioned. Therefore, that's why one has to look very carefully about the use of terms, and why I choose carefully the narrative an abject failure, and I will indicate why that is so. There are, in fact, three linked propositions that underlie that. And I'll just spell them out quickly now, and then move to the development of the argument in relation to them. First of all, we say clearly what happened in Salisbury and the knock-on effect in Amesbury was preventable. We say it was preventable because it was based, that attack was based on the ability of others to have very easy access to the knowledge of Julia Skripal's movements. So information and intelligence by hostile agencies, particularly Russia, obviously, in this case. That's one half of it. And the other half of it we put in the opening, namely there was alarming access to where Sergei lived in Salisbury. In other words, the knowledge of where he lived, the description of where he lived, and in fact, as you know, you've looked at the aerial photographs and so on, you can not only access it from the front, you can get in from the back, and sometimes the back door was left open. So you had a situation here of incredibly easy access to where he lived. So that's the first proposition.
Right.
It could have been prevented based on what actually happened. It certainly could. We will suggest in the questions towards the end of what I have to say today how that could have been effected. Secondly, and this is important but linked to that, we say the risk of a threat of this kind, that is an attack on somebody such as Sergei Skripal as a target, was manifestly obvious. And you don't have to be working in specialist areas or departments, or even, as they say sometimes, a rocket scientist, to work this one out. And I'll indicate some of the factors which must have stood out very easily at the time. And the point about the risk of an attack on the target, as I've put it, is the huge collateral risk to the public. And that's the theme, really, is the risk to the public in all of this, not just to Mr. Skripal and his daughter. And the final related proposition is this, and I've hinted at it, namely, what was done about this? And we say nothing. And we say nothing because of the absence of any basic, obvious precautions that could have been taken. And again, these are not precautions that are difficult to discern. And again, you will see why we say that when we deal with the questions at the end. At the end of my submission is the only part that I'll probably ask you to look at, page 7 onwards. We make, I'm not going to go through them now, but that's where they appear. We have 5 main questions, and there are at least examples of 20 further supplementaries. 5 main, 20 supplementaries. Now, I say, with due respect, it's not intended to either provide a basis for your own assessment. I'm quite sure, and the family are sure, that you're already aware of a lot of these questions, as is those who represent you in the inquiry here. So it's not intended to indicate there's a gap here. It's intended to ensure that the public recognise that the family would like these questions that I'll go through later asked by you, and in one case answered with a public dimension. Because the failure has been so serious, there is, we say, a duty to the public here for there to be a proper explanation in public of how such a failure has nearly led to catastrophic consequences. So it is only in those circumstances. If this was something far less, then it perhaps may not merit it. But we ask you to consider that as we go through. Yep. So a major disaster averted, but not by the authorities, but by good fortune and good work by a lot of people who had to come in and work it out at a rather later stage. And before I get to the questions that we're asking, or rather asking you to ask, and your counsel to ask, and we're assured, and of course we can't be told which ones, that they will be asked, I just need to, as it were, deal with what possible explanations can there be for no precaution. We say no precautions on very clear evidence, which you have heard already. I'm not going to go through it all, but basically, there's no evidence that there were any precautions taken. And when these matters were put in those extensive interviews with the Skripals, they were actually asked, well, what about an alarm, what about a light, and all the rest? Nothing. So as far as it can be told, not only was there nothing on the ground, Mr. Skripal, when he provided a statement recently, indicated he wasn't aware of any. He didn't even know who was responsible. He hadn't seen any risk assessments. It may be that risk assessments wouldn't necessarily go to him. However, there is no evidence that any were taken. So we just pose these. I appreciate they're speculative because we are, as they say, dancing in the dark here. We don't know what's going to be said, who's going to be called, or what they're going to say. But the first port of call here as to what might be said about this abject failure, and it was said at the time, Sir John Sawyers, who was head of MI6 at the time of the exchange, said later these words, "Now clearly we've got that calculation wrong." Now the calculation he's indicating is the level of risk. If this is going to be what is put forward, we say it's not adequate by any means. I can't deal with it in detail because we don't know whether it will be, but anticipating reasonably that this might be one of the ways in which it is going to be said the mistake was made, we say again, because of what they knew, that is the authorities at the time, for there to be no precautions taken, are they saying there was no risk? Are they saying there was no realistic risk? Or it was a low risk, which is a comment that's made in an email to Sir Mark Sedwill. In relation to any of those, we say it's not good enough because of the knowledge they had, there was a risk. And that's the assessment that had to be made. Can I just put in parenthesis here? You've had a lot of evidence over the last week or so of how it was assessed very early that it was highly probable, likely to have been Russia. Now, the very material that was being used by the experts then to work out who might have done it is the very same process as saying, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe we should have various things in place to prevent it happening.
Plus the use of a substance which was, rightly or wrongly, and I'll decide about that, attributed to that state.
Well, there's that, and that indication actually bears upon the rest of what they knew. They knew about Novichok. I'll come to it as a Sedwill letter. I may not take too much time on it,
no,
as you obviously recognise. So we would certainly say that they had enough information not to prove finally, as this inquiry obviously has a different task. At that time, their task was a clear one, the one I've already mapped out, namely to assess whether if there is a risk, you err on the side of caution, particularly when you're dealing with Russia.
Okay.
It may be of some interest that just before we started in Salisbury, I alluded to it in my opening, that the head of MI5 chose an opportunity to speak in public, which was rare, about the dangers we face.
Becoming more common.
Yes. And now we've had another one 2 days ago, not by head of MI5 this time, head of MI6, indicating what might be coming our way via Russia. So we would say once they realized that Russia was involved, because you had a Russian, if you like, subject or victim here, they would have known long before, once he was swapped back in 2010, they must have been accumulating information of the kind that we will see in a moment is very pertinent. If they're going to say, I'll finish on this particular aspect, in other words, are they going to say low risk? If they're going to say, oh, well, he was pardoned, I think, as Skripal himself said, that's a bit of paper. At the end of the day, you're going to trust a pardon given by somebody who's a traitor and all those other adjectives that have been attributed to him, which we put in our written submissions. And obviously, you will have plenty of references to how he was viewed and how he might have been viewed. So one has to just pause at this moment, knowing you've got, and I'm going to say, although it's not admitted or denied in the usual way, you've got a double agent sitting in Salisbury who's Russian and who has undoubtedly being in a very high position or in a high responsible position with information of this kind, that the Russians are just going to ignore what's going on. And of course, we say, for reasons I'll come to in a moment, he certainly went on, and that's part of the problem. Are they going to say that? So that's one explanation we say doesn't hold water. The second one might be that what we're putting forward for you to ask in the closed sessions is a product of hindsight. It's all very well to look back. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that because we say what we have to ask is not based on the benefit of hindsight, because I'm going to use materials that must have been known, were referred to. So we say that doesn't hold water either. And if they indicate, thirdly, well, we did think about all of this, but it was expensive and it's disproportionate, and we weren't going to put any of these things in place, we would say, well, the cost of human lives can't be measured in this way. Secondly, look at the cost of not doing something. Now, I'm not going to belabor how many millions have been spent on the clear up and so on. This was a sum of money which plainly could have been avoided if some simple, obvious precautions had been put in place. Finally, if it's said, well, Sturgess Skripal himself didn't want anything, that's not enough either, because of the obligation to the British public and the United Kingdom public. The fact that he thinks he doesn't need it because of what he thinks he can do, we say is a factor, but it's not a determinative factor. So therefore, when you're making an assessment of what's needed, when it's basic ways in which it can be averted, then we say that doesn't determine, as I say, the exercise. Therefore, at the moment, unless there's an explanation or rationalisation that I've missed, I can't deal with it any further, and I don't want to take up time with fanciful possibilities that are not there. So may I just turn to something far more substantial, and that is what they knew at the time. Now, I'm going to try and avoid documents because we've seen probably too many in this case. But I've asked that when you have a moment, if haven't, you probably have already read it, but the Litvinenko report is extremely important on this aspect.
Yeah.
You have it in the witness pack that was provided in relation to Jonathan Allen. And I've just asked for one page out of it because we say there are a lot of illuminating and educative similarities, as Mr. Allen said himself last week. There are one or two differences, but on the whole, there's sufficient material in this case to allow you or the people doing the assessment of risk to have come to a completely different conclusion had they really applied their minds. The page is 005335 00109.
It's 5335, is it?
Yes.
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 Yeah, you're quite right. Of course, I've read it, but it's useful to have the note of the number.
But sometimes, well, in my case, I can't speak for others. Sometimes it helps to go back to the document and see what it actually says. One of the points about, I've chosen this particular page, entitled The Polonium Trail. And the reason for choosing this page is you will see paragraph 6.4. Forensic scientists were sent to conduct tests for alpha radiation at a series of locations across London and subsequently beyond. The results demonstrated widespread radioactive contamination at locations that have been linked to Mr. Lugovi and Mr. Curtin and Mr. Litvinenko in a period of a little over 2 weeks from mid-October until the onset of Mr. Litvinenko's fatal illness in early November. So, in fact, that chapter goes on in some detail as to what they had to do to track it down. Now, the point that we make arising out of this is, first of all, the actual incident was in 2006.
Yeah.
But the report was 2016. It's 2 years, that's all, before these events. And what is interesting is, well, I suggest that it is, namely the duty superintendent in Wiltshire, who came on at the beginning, in the middle of the night, You have his statement. He hasn't given live evidence. Superintendent Corner, now retired.
Yes.
And we give the references, but you may remember that he said, and he put it in his statement, that almost the first thing that occurred to him was this case. And he was quite right to think of it. And we say to the risk assessors, it should have been the first case in their minds as well. But he's not the only one, because, of course, Keith Asman, who you heard here, who was head of this, the search for a secondary vial or container and so on, he was involved in Litvinenko, and we were advised not to ask too many questions of him because you've got the report. So we didn't ask any questions of him. But in fact, Litvinenko was definitely on the lips of a large number of people for very good reason, because the report having come out about 2 years before, it had everybody was, I won't say everybody was talking about. If you're in the intelligence community, you can hardly not have known about the case. So what is important? First of all, that Litvinenko, it is said by the report itself, was assassinated, basically, by the organisation for whom he worked, exactly the same as Skripal, except he survived, fortunately. In other words, in his case, it's KGB and FSB, and that it was probably approved by Putin. So same factors coming to play. Here, of course, it's GRU instead of KGB. Second point of similarity, the retribution for Litvinenko, in his case, because he was an outspoken critic. In our case, we say because he was a betrayer, a traitor, and was thought to be continuing his work for various European governments, never mind the British. And it is that he arrived, this is Litvinenko, in this country in 2000. But nothing happened until 2006. Not a mirror image, but close. Because the same in our case, Mr. Litvinenko arrived in 2010, nothing happened until 2018. Next aspect of similarity is the administration in a public place of a highly toxic metallic chemical. Exactly the same, very difficult to detect, only really capable of being produced by Russia itself, because it is said that the origins come from nuclear reactors. The methods of, as it were, administration and effect are the same as here, namely inhalation, swallowing, or skin contact, that it can be in liquid form, just as here. And he, Litvinenko, died, and I say it with obviously some bearing upon what happened in Dawn's case, from cardiac arrest caused by acute radiation syndrome.
Well,
so we say all
cardiac arrest tends to be what finishes most people off, Mr. Mansfield.
I appreciate it. But these, if you're trying to make an assessment, that's all these are points about. If you're making an assessment, and you're aware of this background, which is set out in the, if I may say so, meticulous report that by Sir Robert is telling.
Yeah.
I made the point about it's in a public place. It's in fact more than one public place. The main one was the Pine Bar in the Millennium Hotel in London, but there was an earlier attempt, it is thought, elsewhere. But the point about administration in public shows that the authorities must have realised that Russia's prepared to go to any length, and it's reckless. It's the reckless point.
Yeah.
So they knew that as well. So that's why you're dealing with the public as well as an individual. And I've already dealt with the fact that, although nobody's saying that Mr. Skripal was a severe critic, but if he was, as he thought he had been targeted, it's the phrase you may remember, number one reason. He thinks it's the number one reason he, Skripal, was targeted, the reason being that he was perceived to be going on with the work of a double agent, effectively. Now, finally on this, on the Litvinenko comparisons, what is of interest is that Mr. Skripal's been interviewed, he's given recent statement, and as you know, we made a request for him to attend. When he gives his statement about what he was doing, what I said to the other day, what was he up to, he doesn't tell you. There's nothing in his statement about the suggestions that have been made publicly and frequently about whether he was or he wasn't passing information and intelligence to other governments about how GRU works. So he hasn't denied it, and he hasn't indicated what he was doing. The interest is that the author, who's attended here sometimes, Mr. Urban, in his book, it's a very poignant little passage where he says he goes to interview Skripal in his home as a journalist. So this is the extent to which precautions have been sent to the wind. He's there in his home in 2017, interviewing, in the middle of which Mr. Skripal, according to the recollection of Mark Urban, is he has to stop the interview because he, Skripal's, got an appointment in Switzerland with intelligence authorities. In other words, there's a very strong indication here that that's the reason, at the end of the day, that he, Skripal, was targeted, and he accepting that that's the case. May I then, in a sense, that's the starting place, but really the matter that brings it all to a head, if one wasn't convinced even by that, we say that's enough to come up with a better assessment than what's happened, is, again, a document you've seen many times, you've read many times. I perhaps don't need to get it up on screen again, but if you don't mind me just racing through the main points.
Not at all.
It is, in fact,
Which one is it?
it's the Sedwell letter.
Oh, the Sedwell letter, yes.
Sedwell letter, 13th of April. It's a little bit later. But we say this letter demonstrates that what government knew. And the terms of this letter have been adopted by the Prime Minister, Jonathan Allen, and other spokespeople at the United Nations. Some of it exactly the same wording. So it's very clear that this was, certainly by this stage, a common and agreed summary. And Mr. Allen said that the government stands by some of the statements that are in here. He hasn't gone through every single one, and no doubt he can be asked more. But when you begin to look at the letter, perhaps if we could just have up, and it's the only other document I've asked for, it's INQ 003070 402. It's the second page of that letter. Is that up there? I'll just wait a second for it to come up. There we are. As Mr. O'Connor went through this the other day, I can zoom through it. Starting at the top of the page, there are 3 points that he's making. The main one on this page is obviously the amount of information and credible open source material and for a chemical weapons program of which Novichok's were one part, and then he names it. And he names the reasons it does. It's done in a certain context. And then the next paragraph in the middle of it, in the mid-2000s, President Putin was closely involved in the Russian chemical weapons program. So it's pretty, we say it's very clear, not only Russia, but Putin and Novichok's. So that's the first point. Now, I pause here because the questions we pose at the end is, who else knew about this? Was it just Semark or others? Because we say this sort of information should have been available to those who have the responsibility for protective measures. Because had they had access to this, they've got to explain why on the back of it they didn't begin to see, to notice even, that there's a real risk here, not a fanciful one, a real risk. So the second point he makes is they have a proven record of conducting state-sponsored assassination. Well, wait a minute again. It's an obvious point. It's a flag for somebody. It mentions the Owen report. I've just gone through that, so I don't. And that the Russian state may have sponsored attacks against its opponents using poisons. Again, that comes from the report itself. So all of this was known, that it was Russia, assassination to legitimate targets, Sergei Skripal would have been seen as a legitimate target or defector or previous intelligence officer. It's put in different ways in these documents. Yeah. So that the key passage, or one of the other key passages, are on the next page at the top, the last and third page of this. During the 2000s, Russia commenced a program and so on. And it included ways of delivering nerve agents, including by application to door handles. Well, again, one has to say, you don't have to be that equipped and, as it were, au fait with the ways of the intelligence world not to have thought to yourself, well, who knew that? How long have they known that? And if they did know that, what did they do to stop it, to prevent it? One of our precautions would have made that impossible. But, of course, it hasn't been thought of, apparently. And we say, that's why we say it's an abject failure, because they had on a plate the materials of actually what happened. And then, thirdly, you've got, if you like, the bit that Mr. Allen himself remarked upon in this third, the motive, former Russian military intelligence and so on, convicted of espionage. It is highly likely that the Russian intelligence services view at least some of its defectors as legitimate targets, point we've already made in the previous paragraph, and then we have this. We have information indicating Russian intelligence service interest in the Skripals, dating back at least to as far as 2013. I pause. You might like to make a note that this is supported by a book by a Bellingcat in which a very similar point is made, that their communications were being monitored up till the time that Julia flew from Moscow to London. Now, we haven't been able, and we can't, but you can. So how long had they known about this date, I'm assuming, from 2013? They don't say that it stopped in 2013. So what happened between 2013 and 2008? All these are questions that are supplementaries, which we say will, we think, actually illustrate the deficiency in this case when one looks at the detail. So that the one thing you do, I hope it's not, is too simplistic. I'm a risk assessor. I'd go to Mr. Skripal and I'd say to him, hey, look, we've got information that your communications are being interfered with, because the Skripals say they don't know anything about it. You'd warn them and say, for goodness sake, if you're going to do something like advise Swiss government on intelligence matters, the one thing might be helpful if you didn't make it public and if your communications about your movements were kept rather more clandestine than they are. And of course one knows there are other ways of doing it, but it seems they weren't warned, and they weren't warned about the question of the door handles either, a matter which they might have had quite a bit to say if they'd known that that was going to be what was going to happen. So we say that letter, combined with the actual case that had happened, provides you with quite enough information on its own, without more, that the risk assessment in this case was not just a miscalculation, it was an abject failure not to provide, we say, basic provision. Could you very kindly just turn to page 7, which is where we set out the questions which we indicate are based on this analysis.
Yes.
Page 7. I'm really going to concentrate on the bold print, the main question. Mm-hmm. The supplementaries come after, and again, they're questions which the family would like asked, and it's a matter plainly for your good self and my learned friend. The first question is, why were no obvious, proportionate, and basic measures taken to protect the Skripals and hence the wider public? Now, obvious observations on that. This is the only question I think demands to be, as it were, detailed in public, because people are saying, well, you've been going on about the fact, what are these provisions? Well, we actually list them, and we say at the bottom of page 7 that had any of these, and certainly some of them, been implemented what happened in Salisbury would have been made virtually impossible. And there they all are set out on page 8. Mm-hmm. The first and most obvious one is an alternative identity, a change in appearance, a different occupation and life narrative and routine, a residence at an unknown location and accommodation changed periodically, certainly one at which he doesn't entertain journalists and make it clear exactly where he lives, and again would have made it very difficult. Accommodation protected, this is important. No security cameras, no lighting, no alarms, nothing focused on door handles, since they did know about that. And again, had this been taken, when they do their recce, they would have discovered that there are CCTV cameras available showing the front door.
Your case is that they ought to have anticipated specifically
Yes.
something focused on door handles.
Yes.
I see.
And it basically was nothing.
Yep.
The whole premises were not, and I've listed the rest. And we say, the one other I just highlight, and again, it would have saved money, is that he didn't live in a house that had access from front and back unimpeded. He actually lived in a gated estate, of which there are many, which would need an entry code to get through the main gate. Then you need an entry code for the block. Possibly there's a security guard or someone, a concierge, on duty. Just that alone would have made it almost impossible to carry out what they did. Of course, if Her Majesty's government say, oh yeah, well, we had thought about that, but then we thought they'll get in anywhere. That doesn't do when it comes to protecting the public. You have to do what you can as humanly possible, and we say nothing was done that was humanly possible. So we say that first question and the supplementaries are important. The second question, well, the supplementaries are on the next page, but there is one supplementary on page 9 to that question about where the Skripals warned that Russia was targeting their communications. That comes out of the Sedwell letter and Bellingcat and so on. Now, it would appear they weren't warned. And what I set out on page 9 and 10 is the ease with which the Russian intelligence, I've called it an electronic trail, it begins at the bottom of page 9, how they could have known well in advance, as well as nearer the time, when Julia was going. They needed her there.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Yeah, they needed when she was going.
So
And
are you inviting me to investigate whether the timing of Julia's visit was material?
yes,
In what way?
because we say this was a targeted assassination. They needed to ensure that he was in a place where they could at least get at him, whoever else didn't matter.
Yes.
And then one way they could do it was, that's why they do it when she's going, because they know she's going, and they know that she will be there.
But if you're right in what you've been saying for the last 10 minutes, he was easily accessible to them at any time, whether she was in this country or any other.
Well, yes, but not quite enough.
Right.
They need to make sure he's in the premises on a
Yes.
particular, because they only come for the weekend, as it
Oh, I
were.
see. All right. I think I've got it. Thank you.
So, and I won't take time spelling out all the manoeuvres on page 10. Basically, the Skripals indicate that they didn't take care of their communications. In fact, Mr. Skripal, in his latest statement, which we say bears out the vulnerability here, only ever remembers using his landline to make, and there were all those conversations with the Cassidys, that he wasn't going, and they were going to lunch and all the rest of it. And we say it's no coincidence that they go when, that is, the two suspects go to the premises when everybody else has gone to London Airport. And then the next day they go when it's anticipated, quite rightly as it happens, that she and he will be in the premises before going out around lunchtime. And that they come back, maybe this bit is a coincidence, they happen to come back very closely to the moment that they finally leave to go for lunch. So we say the movements of the Scripples plus the accessibility of the premises, they're sitting ducks.
Right.
And this should have been foreseen by those responsible for their protection and the public's protection. Second main question on page 11. Why were no agencies relevant to precautionary measures, emergency response, medical treatment or investigation informed of Sir J. Scripples' residence in Salisbury over an 8-year period?
Yep.
Speaks for itself. We have evidence already that no one knew, including Wiltshire Police in particular didn't know. That's why Mr. Corner, Superintendent Corner, had to do some guesswork and look it all up on Google to sort of make an inroad on it. So question 3, what steps were taken to prepare for the possibility of Novichok being applied to door handles? Well, again, I've asked that in the said context of the letter you've already seen.
Yep.
There are a lot of supplementaries. I don't take time further on that. It's obvious what the questions are. The fourth question is the risk assessments. Now, it's a matter I've raised before you before. In other words, what were carried out? At the moment, we don't know about any of them. If there were, and that's the big question, and if there were, who did them and what elements did they take account of, and did it include any of the materials that I've been through? And there are supplementaries there that are fairly obvious. And finally, you come to the perpetrators themselves, question 5. This is important because of recent evidence. I don't take time on it because you will recall that Commander Murphy was taken in some detail through visa applications right here in front of you. We say here that either as an alias or as a real name, were they known before this event on March the 4th? And what do they do? What did the security services do to alert those on border control about the movements of these two? Their visa applications were plainly flawed, as you've seen in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
Discrepancies, inconsistencies, and contradictions. Somebody should have said, wait a minute, because these are, the intelligence services must, we say, have been alert to giving priority to ensuring guarding against Russian incursion, because they're the ones with the record of a Novichok's program and assassination. So we say those are the questions that we would like you to ask, and obviously it's in your discretion the extent to which they are. But one...
Well, Mr. Mansell, it's very helpful to have them set out that way, and be assured
Thank you.
the object of the exercise will be to address those questions.
May I finish on this note, which may be a bridge too far, but that perhaps is not the point. One of these questions, that's the first one, we say is so important because if we're right that no precautions were taken and it's a matter of, in other words, they're not going to come along and say, oh, well, we had a secret helicopter parked on the top of Salisbury Town Hall or something. But assuming they don't come up with that one, we would suggest as a possibility here, because of the misinformation that Russia has actually specialized in, and the need for transparency here, that some of these questions, that one, question 1, or its answer, should be made public, so that the family and the public can be reassured. If it's a mistake by somebody, well, we're going to say it's not particularly understandable, but if it is a mistake, it's got to be explained and somebody's got to be accountable because of the risk to thousands of people emphasised by heads of both security agencies in the last few days. And that brings me to it's only a suggestion which I've mentioned to others this morning, and that is the family are not only grateful to the way the inquiry is being conducted, you've heard that, but they're also concerned about implementation of any recommendations. Now, I'm sorry to be addressing you now, but I'm probably not going to get another opportunity unless you convene us all again in the ensuing months. And that is this, that you might consider two possibilities, that, assuming you make some recommendations in relation to these and all the other matters. assuming you do, that before you do that, you ask the government agencies responsible what their response is before you publish the report. That's one way I know that it's been done in other cases. Because again, the public might like to know that the government has accepted or hasn't accepted. The other way, and they're not mutually exclusive, of doing it is in fact, as part of the final report, it isn't finalised in the full sense. You indicate that there will be further hearings at which you will want to investigate whether the departments to whom the recommendations have been addressed have actually done anything. And we say the family are concerned that it's the, as it were, the cap on everything to know that their grief has produced a situation such as that.
Got it. Thank you. I'll think about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mansfield. Right. Ms. Giovanetti, is it you next?
I think it is, sir, yes.
Thank you.
I think you've generally been taking a break at about 12:45. I'm happy to pause my submissions at any convenient moment.
Tell me how long you think you're likely to be.
I think 45 minutes-ish.
Well, we can probably go up until just about 1 o'clock.
Thank you very much for that, sir. Could I start firstly by reiterating on behalf of Operation Tabasco the sympathies of the entire team to Dawn Sturgess' family and her friends, of course at the heart of this inquiry. Secondly, could I say how grateful we are for the opportunity to make a full written closing statement, and we're working to provide a comprehensive document addressing the various issues your inquiry has explored, including public safety and the CBRN advice. I think I might be a bit too far removed from the microphone. Thank you. Today's oral closing statement is intended to be much narrower in scope. We'd like to focus on 10 propositions that we say cumulatively lead clearly to the conclusion that the men that we've been referring to as Ruslan Boshirov, Alexander Petrov and Sergei Fedotov were responsible for placing Novichok on the door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road on the 4th of March 2018 with the intention of killing Sergei Skripal, and that they were acting on behalf of the Russian state. Finally, and importantly for your terms of reference, I'd like to summarise why we say you can safely reach the conclusion that their actions led directly to the death of Dawn Sturgess.
Yes.
Before moving to those key propositions, I will, if I may, say a little about the counter-terrorism policing. I'm going to use the acronym CTP, if you don't mind. I'll try and steer clear of alphabet soup generally. But the CTP investigations, which identified much of the evidence which underpins them. As you've heard, the CTP network provides the UK's law enforcement response to a range of national security threats, including countering threats posed by Russia and other state actors. The attack on the Skripals, which in our submission led directly to the death of Dawn Sturgess, was not only an attack sponsored by a foreign state, but also the first identified use of a chemical weapon in the United Kingdom. As Commander Murphy said, it's not easy to explain the scale, complexity, and significance of the police investigations that followed it, and state threats to the UK are increasing. And in order to meet that challenge, CTP's work to tackle state-sponsored activity continues to develop at pace. You've heard about the 3 operations, Wadana, Katerva and Reed, that CTP conducted in response to the Salisbury and Amesbury poisonings. Those highly complex criminal investigations were aimed both at bringing those responsible to justice and protecting the public from further harm, with public safety, of course, being a key consideration throughout. They're carried out in the context, significant impact on local communities, delicate management of international relations, the attention of the national and international media, and the security and other challenges of conducting police investigations into what transpired to be a capable and advanced foreign spy agency. From the earliest stages, those investigations were wide-ranging. They included, as you've heard, investigating the individuals with whom Julia Skripal may have had contact on her journey, the Skripals' telephone data, content from their digital devices, inquiries as to other vehicles on the motorway near to the Cassidys' pickup truck after they collected the Skripals from the airport. The scale and complexity of the forensic work undertaken was striking, even by comparison with other major investigations. In particular, sir, your inquiries heard from Keith Asman, CTPSE's head of forensic, on the technical forensic work that took place, and on no fewer than 8 separate days from Commander Murphy, speaking on behalf of CTP on almost all the topics that your inquiries explored. Following the submission of evidence by CTP, as you know, the Crown Prosecution Service authorised charges against Ruslan Boshirov, Alexander Petrov and Sergei Fedotov for conspiracy to murder Sergei Skripal, the attempted murders of Sergei Skripal, Yulia Skripal and Nick Bailey, causing grievous bodily harm with intent to Yulia Skripal and Nick Bailey, and possession and use of a chemical weapon, contrary to the Chemical Weapons Act 1996. The conclusion of CTP's investigations is indeed that Ruslan Boshirov, Alexander Petrov and Sergei Fedotov were responsible for placing Novichok on the door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road on the 4th of March 2018 with the intention of killing Sergei Skripal, and that they were acting on behalf of the Russian state in their capacity as members of the GRU. And we've distilled from the evidence the following propositions, which we hope will assist you to come to that conclusion.
Right.
So taking them in turn, the first proposition relates to location. And we agree with Mr. Straw that it's clear that the primary point of contamination was the front door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road. The levels of contamination on that door handle were very substantially higher than at any other location, working back in sequence from the time and the place that the Skripals fell ill. By itself, that is powerful evidence that this was the most likely first point of contamination.
Right.
That conclusion is consistent with the accounts given by Sergei and Yulia Skripal about them both touching the front door handle to leave the address on the 4th of March. It's also consistent with the fact that a number of the items that Sergei Skripal touched after arriving home on the night of the 3rd of March were not contaminated with Novichok, such as his diabetes monitor, bedside light and the downstairs toilet, nor was Yulia Skripal's iPad, which she used on the morning of the 4th of March, and neither were the inside or outside of her travel bag. While we'll deal in writing with the detail, and can I just pause to say our written submissions will cover all of this in more detail and give you references to the underlying documents and the transcripts of the oral evidence. But we also say the evidence rules out other points of contamination, including Zizzi's, the mill, London Road Cemetery, the inside of 47 Christie Miller Road, and any suggestion that Yulia may have brought the poison into the country herself. In particular, we say that you can place no real weight on the Blink interview conducted with Yulia Skripal by Dr. Cockcroft, if you remember the evidence about that.
I do.
In which she's reported to indicate that she thought she'd been sprayed in Zizzi's. If you're satisfied on that, I won't develop that point any further, but we say it's inconsistent with the accounts that she gave subsequently when she wasn't under the influence of medication.
I say no more about it at the moment, Miss Giovanatti, but that you need not push at that door.
Thank you very much. As you'll recall, the internal contamination at 47 Christie Miller Road did cause some initial difficulties in the investigation, both from the perspective of officers' staff safety and in establishing how and when it occurred. But ultimately, it became clear that the presence of Novichok inside the house was most likely to be from cross-contamination, arising out of the initial searches, and that conclusion is borne out by the low levels of Novichok found inside the house, which are consistent with secondary transfer rather than primary contamination. They're also consistent with the clear evidence of DS Bailey touching the front door and the contamination of the PPE used by searching officers and the subsequent contamination of PC Bell as well, which must have been a result of contamination either directly or indirectly from the searching officers. No other possible site of primary contamination has been identified, and in our submission, it's been definitely proven that the front door handle was the first point of contamination.
Right.
Second proposition, timing. The front door handle of the Scripples address must have been contaminated after they returned home on the evening of the 3rd of March 2018 and before they left home again at about 13:30 hours on the 4th of March. It's a shorter point. The front door handle hadn't yet been contaminated when the Scripples returned home on the evening of the 3rd of March, given that the Cassidys and their car were clear of Novichok, and you've heard about that from Mr. Straw, even though Maureen Cassidy had touched the front door handle. Also, this point's made good by the fact that many of the items used by the Scripples inside the house that evening and the following morning weren't contaminated. The evidence before you demonstrates that the Scripples did not leave home again until shortly before 13:30 on the 4th of March, at which point Sergei's BMW, you'll recall, was seen travelling up India Avenue. And since they didn't return to the property after that point, they must have been contaminated by the front door handle as they left. Third proposition relates to the weapon. The Scripples were contaminated with Novichok, a complex nerve agent that isn't readily available or easy to acquire. There is no doubt, we say, that the Scripples fell ill as a result of exposure to Novichok. The evidence from Salisbury District Hospital and from FT49 establishes that beyond doubt. MK26 gave evidence that Novichok is a complex nerve agent which cannot safely be manufactured in any ordinary laboratory. They also confirmed that in their professional assessment, the purity of the Novichok found in this case was such that it could not have been manufactured in a non-state facility. And as you observed, sir, yourself, I think, as Mr. Straws adverted to, there is no evidence of Novichok being brought to the UK either prior to the events of March 2018 or indeed subsequently. Our fourth proposition. Petrov and Boshirov's movements on the 4th of March 2018 demonstrate that they had the opportunity to target 47 Christie Miller Road within the relevant window of time. So those movements have been extensively investigated. To establish that they had the opportunity to target 47 Christie Miller Road, all that's necessary is to examine Journey 3, as we've been calling it.
Yeah, well, it's 3 and or 4, isn't it?
3 and or 4, but we're focused on 3 for this.
Yes.
Yeah. During which CTP says they deployed Novichok onto the front door handle between midday and 12:15 on the 4th of March 2018. The CCTV evidence establishes that after arriving at Salisbury train station on that day, they arrived at around 11:45. They walked west away from the town centre. They walked along Wilton Road, past the mosque, past the Horse and Groom Public House, and finally past the Shell petrol station at 12 o'clock. They next appeared on Devizes Road, you'll recall, at 12:15. Once the CCTV cameras on which they don't appear are taken into account, and that's including those on India Avenue, Macklin Road, as well as those further up Wilton Road and Devizes Road, once those are factored in, the only route they can realistically have taken is via Christie Miller Road. That's on Journey 3. As Commander Murphy confirmed, 15 minutes is sufficient time for them to have walked that route, including applying Novichok to the door of 47 Christie Miller Road. They therefore, at least on that journey, had the opportunity to apply Novichok to the front door in the relevant time frame.
Right.
Our fifth proposition is that Petrov's and Boshirov's movements throughout the period of the 2nd to the 4th of March 2018 demonstrate the intent to target 47 Christie Miller Road. And this proposition's based on the evidence of their movements across the period of slightly more than 2 days that they spent in the UK. Having arrived in London from Moscow on the afternoon of the 2nd of March, it's about 4:20 that we see them going through the arrivals hall, they travelled from London to Salisbury and back twice in 2 days before leaving on the evening of the 4th of March. On their first visit to Salisbury on the 3rd of March, they twice walked to the vicinity of Christie Miller Road via different routes. On each of those occasions, that's Journey 1 and Journey 2, analysis of the available CCTV indicates that they must have walked down Christie Miller Road itself.
What about down, but certainly past the entrance to it,
Past the entrance to
Yes.
Christie Miller Road.
at least.
Yes. Turning to the following day, I've just explored Journey 3, but again that shows a return to Christie Miller Road. On Journey 4, for the 4th time in 2 days, Petrov and Bosherov walk away from the city centre and towards a residential part of Salisbury. This time, their route must have taken them from Wilton Road, up Highbury Avenue and onto Devizes Road. They would have had time en route to access Christie Miller Road via the footpath from Highbury Avenue, using the same footpath out and back. That would, we say, have been consistent with their behaviour on each of their other journeys to the area. There's no other explanation for why they were going there. The timings indicate that they would have been there more or less exactly at the time that the Scripples were leaving the address, as shown by the CCTV footage of Petrov and Bosherov on Devizes Road, you'll recall at 13:40, about 5 minutes after the Scripples appeared in their car driving along that road. We now know that 47 Christie Miller Road was, during the time frame of Petrov and Bosherov's third visit, in fact the target of a nerve agent attack. There is no evidence of any innocent reason for their presence in that immediate area. The obvious inference, taken cumulatively with the other propositions, is that their interest in that area was specifically to target 47 Christie Miller Road.
Right.
6th proposition. Petrov and Bosherov's own accounts of their movements and intentions are deliberate lies. The only account available from them is that broadcast by RT on the 13th of September 2018. And this was shortly after a limited amount of information from the CTP investigation had been placed into the public domain, you'll recall. The accounts they gave were palpably untruthful. For example, they said their real names were Petrov and Bosherov, and as you've heard and as we'll look at briefly in a moment, even those basic facts about them were untrue. Secondly, their account of what they did in Salisbury on the 3rd of March is fundamentally inconsistent with the CCTV of their movements that day. In particular, having made determined efforts to reach Salisbury by public transport, despite the disruption caused by heavy snow, which we'll remember they repeatedly referred to, they then walked around a residential area of the city, making no attempt at all to head towards the historic centre. They spent far longer in Salisbury than they said they did in the RT interview. As to the 4th of March, Petrov said, "We had the aim of visiting Old Sarum and the cathedral and decided to finish all that on the 4th. That's inconsistent with their actual behaviour that day, a further 2 visits to Christie Miller Road. And while it's possible that they passed by the cathedral in the 33 minutes when they weren't captured by CCTV, it's wholly impossible for them to have visited Old Sarum, which, as you know, is 2 miles from the station and the cathedral, and which Petrov had said they really wanted to see. There are multiple other demonstrable untruths within that interview, and we'll address them in more detail in our closing statement. But we say that the lies were clearly synchronised between the pair in advance and that they came thick and fast on a whole range of material issues. We say those lies were deliberate and intended to conceal their guilt. There is no other plausible explanation.
Right.
7th proposition. The presence of Novichok at the City Stay Hotel demonstrates that Petrov and Boshirov had the means to commit the attack. So, as you've heard, sir, there's no dispute but that Petrov and Boshirov stayed in room 108 of the City Stay Hotel between the 2nd and 4th of March 2018. When that room was tested on the 4th of May, 2 months later, trace amounts of Novichok were found on the window latch and around the sink, as Mrs. Straw's already said. You'll recall MK26's evidence explaining why those findings are reliable, notwithstanding that they weren't replicated on further testing and there was a positive test on the shaker. MK26 was a careful and obviously expert witness whose evidence we submit you can accept in full, and we agree entirely with the family on that. Mm-hmm. The Novichok found in room 108 was the same specific Novichok found on the front door of 47 Christie Miller Road in Salisbury and in the bottle subsequently recovered from Charlie Rowley's flat in Amesbury. That strongly indicates a link between room 108 and the deployment of that particular Novichok in Salisbury on the 4th of March. And the movements of Petrov and Boshirov provide that link. There is no evidence, as you've heard, of any alternative source for that Novichok being in room 108, either before or after the 4th of March. In particular, there's no possibility that the findings were attributable to cross-contamination or secondary contamination by Petrov and Boshirov, because we know they didn't return to the hotel after visiting Salisbury on the 4th of March. Yep. They must have had the Novichok used in the attack on the Skripals with them in room 108 of the City Stay Hotel prior to the point that it was deployed. In short, before the attack, they had possession of what was intended to be the murder weapon. And as already mentioned, this obviously was not a substance which was easily available or easy to procure. 8th proposition. Fedotov was engaged in a joint enterprise with Petrov and Boshirov. Drawing together the various strands of evidence about Fedotov, we submit that you can safely conclude that he was the third member of the team. He travelled to the UK from Moscow on the same date as Petrov and Boshirov, the 2nd of March 2018, and like them, he departed on the 4th of March. The travel history of these individuals reveals that they often moved around Europe together. We say it's no coincidence that they were in the UK at the same time. Next, one moves on to consider what Fedotov did while in London. There's clear cell site evidence placing him in the vicinity of Waterloo Station at the same time as Petrov and Boshirov were there prior to their first trip to Salisbury on the 3rd of March. On the evening of the 3rd of March, we know that the train on which Petrov and Boshirov travelled back to London arrived at Waterloo Station shortly before 18:30. Their phones, you'll recall, can then be traced moving towards Bond Street, both arriving there at around 18:40 and staying there until at least 7:10, 1910. So let's look then at Fedotov's telephone. Between 1600 hours and 1814, Fedotov's phone stays in the Paddington area near to his hotel. It then appears to disconnect from the network. Bond Street is about a 25-minute walk from Fedotov's hotel.
Walk, yes.
Yeah, walk. The timings are consistent with Fedotov disconnecting his phone from the network and walking to the Bond Street area, where he would have arrived at almost exactly the same time as Petrov and Boshirov.
Right.
If Fedotov's presence in London is not coincidental, which in light of the evidence to the other connections between the three suspects, and I'm going to turn to those in a moment, we say is wholly implausible, then a meeting between the three suspects in the Bond Street area is the most likely explanation for both the movements of Petrov and Boshirov and the way in which Fedotov's phone behaves. He then, of course, leaves the following day before Petrov and Boshirov return from Salisbury. His role in the attack, bearing in mind his travel at the same time, his true identity and the history of joint travel with Petrov and Bosherov, the apparent meetings between them on 3rd of March, and his admission from Petrov and Bosherov's account to RT is that he was, as Commander Murphy assessed, some kind of coordinator or at least support mechanism to Petrov and Bosherov. Now, my submissions in respect to that 8th proposition need to be considered cumulatively with the submissions under the 9th and 10th propositions. And 9 relates to identity. The suspects' true identities, we say, were not Petrov, Bosherov and Fedotov, but Mishkin, Shapiga and Sergeyev. The chain of evidence that establishes those identities is complex. Mr. O'Connor took Commander Murphy through it very carefully and in detail over an extended period of evidence. It's set out in Section G of the police report and the corresponding section of the graphics pack, and we will return to this in detail in our written submissions. In these oral submissions, I simply wish to emphasise one overarching point in respect to the identifications, and that's that in respect of each of these 3 suspects, the identification does not depend on a single piece of evidence, but on a whole range of material, all leading to the same conclusion. Mm-hmm. For Bosherov, the evidence includes his visa applications, his travel patterns, his attendance at a GRU-linked wedding, payments, you'll recall, to someone, a middle-aged man, who, but for the surname Shapiga, fits the details that Bosherov gave for his father, and the strong resemblance between images of Bosherov and images of Shapiga. For Petrov, the identification is supported by his visa applications, comments on social media following the RT interview, links to Bosherov, travel patterns, and the strong resemblance between images of Petrov and of Mishkin. For Fedotov, the identification is similarly supported by visa applications, the data you'll recall from Booking.com, travel patterns, and the strong resemblance between images of Fedotov and Sergeyev. Cumulatively, we say, that evidence provides compelling support for the true identifications of the 3 suspects as Mishkin, Shapiga, and Sergeyev. Any alternative explanation would need to account not for one single thread, but for all of those different strands of evidence. But despite Petrov and Bosherov's protestations of innocence in the RT interview, and despite your inquiry's efforts to obtain the participation of all 3 suspects, they've chosen not to play any role in these proceedings, nor indeed have they returned to this jurisdiction to stand trial following the charges. But in particular, none of them has provided any response to the identifications, which, as you may recall, were publicly announced in September 2021. So you've got nothing from them by way of explanation to weigh against the evidence you've seen and heard. So finally, our 10th proposition, and that's that all 3 suspects are members of the GRU, and specifically Unit 29155. There's considerable overlap between the evidence as to the suspects' real identities on the one hand and the attribution of all 3 of these individuals in their true names to membership of both the GRU and specifically Unit 29155. Mm-hmm. So again, I sure you'll be relieved here that we're going to address the detail in writing rather than my trying to take you through it again today. But the headline point again is that there are multiple separate strands which indicate both connections between the 3 suspects and connections between each of them and the GRU, in particular Unit 29155. That evidence comes from a variety of sources, again, social media photographs and posts, financial records, travel records, visa applications, passport data, the wedding photographs, and it's supported by the conclusions of a NATO and European ally, the Czech Republic, about Petrov and Bosherov's behaviour there in 2014. Again, all of these strands of evidence lead to the same conclusion. And again, nothing is advanced by these three individuals or on their behalf by way of explanation or rebuttal of that evidence. We say you may safely conclude this is because they simply have no answer. Quite apart from any other evidence that you may consider enclosed, CTP submits that there's a sufficient basis for you to be satisfied that all three suspects are members of the GRU, and more specifically of Unit 29155. There are two further topics that I'm going to move on to address. That's firstly that the suspects were acting in their capacity as agents of the Russian state, and finally what that means for how Dawn Sturgess came by her death. I don't know if you'd like me to do those now because I'm pretty
Yes, I
confident.
should think so, Miss Giovanetti. You all right? Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. So turning to the issue of Russian state responsibility for the attack on the Skripals, firstly, we say their status as agents of the GRU itself supports that proposition, particularly in the absence of any evidence that they had any personal reason to target or mount an attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal. But perhaps the most powerful evidence in support of Russian state responsibility is the choice of weapon. You've heard expert evidence that Novichok is a complex nerve agent which could not have been synthesised safely and to the level of purity identified in this case by a non-state agent. The proposition is reinforced by the suspects' use of false identities for which they had genuine identification documents linked by their sequence and their origin. That's a strong indication, we say, of state involvement. It's also reinforced, you may think, by the intense disinformation campaign mounted by the Russian state. It's sought to advance preposterous theories, contrary to the evidence, and supported by misleading assertions and half-truths. The unanswered questions documents produced by the Russian embassy are a convenient example. You heard Mr. Allen describe the embassy's work in this regard as an exercise in disingenuous whataboutism, an attempt to throw dust in people's eyes and to try and divert attention. This more subtle approach to disinformation was complemented by conspiracy theories from Russian state proxies and clear untruths, such as in the RT interview, which is broadcast by a channel described by Mr. Allen as a propaganda organ of the Russian state, you'll recall, and which he said demonstrated the Russian state's culpability. You may take the view that the apparent Russian desperation to point the finger elsewhere only serves as a further indication of their own guilt. In addition, whether there's a motive on the part of the Russian state or any individual within it to attack Mr. Skripal is a matter which you've said you'll return to enclosed. So we don't propose to address that in any detail, but there are some relatively uncontroversial points that we can make today and which featured, you'll remember, in CTP's investigations at an early stage. Firstly, Sergei Skripal was a Russian citizen who, on his account, had formerly worked for the Russian intelligence services. Secondly, and again on his own account and from accounts in the media, he was convicted and jailed in Russia for espionage before moving to the UK in 2010. Thirdly, you'll recall that he's expressed his own personal opinion that the attack was carried out on behalf of the Russian state. And fourthly, there is no evidence of anyone else with a personal motive to harm Sergei or Yulia Skripal, still less anyone who would have had access to Novichok. So even on the open evidence, CTP submits, looked at in the round, there is ample material to enable you to conclude that the three suspects were acting on behalf of the Russian state. Indeed, the alternative appears to be that three individuals who worked for Russian military intelligence decided without authority and with no apparent motive to mount an international assassination attempt, somehow managed without authorization to obtain a quantity of high-purity nerve agent to do so with. Not only is this scenario unsupported by a shred of evidence, it's wholly implausible, and it would be contrary to the evidence you heard from Mr. Allen about the hierarchical and centralised nature of decision-making in Russian politics. And for the purposes of today's submissions, I say no more about Russian state responsibility.
Right.
Finally, what does all this mean for how Dawn Sturgess came about her death? We submit that the inquiry can properly find, that not only did the Russian state carry out the attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal, but that it's responsible for the death of Dawn Sturgess. Again, the detail will be addressed in our written submissions together with references to the underlying evidence. But today, I'd like to simply highlight some of the key evidence pointing to the container recovered from 9 Muggleton Road, most likely being the same container that had previously been used to apply Novichok to the front door handle of 9 Christie Miller Road.
Right.
You've heard that until the tragic events at Muggleton Road, CTP had little intelligence as to what container they were searching for, nor indeed was it known whether there was a container left to find at all. But we now know that the remaining Novichok was in a container disguised as a perfume bottle, which Charlie Rowley had acquired and which he gave to Dawn Sturgess as a present. Precisely when and where he did so, we may never know. We would suggest that the most helpful starting point may be what's known about the suspects' movements on the 3rd and 4th of March 2018. On the 3rd of March, their movements are clear. They didn't go into the centre of Salisbury. Their movements on the 4th of March are less well established, including in particular a continuous period of 33 minutes during which their locations aren't accounted for. You heard from Commander Murphy about the substantial work that was done to identify the scope of the areas that the suspects could have travelled on foot within that period. As he said, in this context, 33 minutes is a long time. The efforts resulted in a series of maps covering an expanse which included Queen Elizabeth Gardens, the adjacent nature reserve and a nearby hamlet, as well as several areas of Salisbury city centre. In response to a question about whether Petrov and Bosharov might, for example, feasibly have been to the Brown Street car park during those 33 minutes, you'll recall that Commander Murphy said, yes, it would have been a slightly unusual route back to Bridge Street, but yes, of course, they could have done. In the time allowed, that was possible, yes. Charlie Rowley's recollections have been expressed with some uncertainty, and he himself has said that his memory is very poor. You may consider that you can't place very much weight on his account in isolation, nor where it's inconsistent with other evidence. But in light of his practice of bin dipping, and given what's known of the suspect's movements, you may conclude that it's most likely that the bottle was discarded in one of the many dustbins, I think you said yourself, must be hundreds, around Salisbury. As to when the bottle was recovered by Mr. Rowley, it seems most likely, in light of the evidence that street and shop bins were emptied frequently, that he found the bottle shortly after it was discarded. That's consistent with the absence of significant weathering on the cardboard box. And the evidence suggests that he was engaged in bin dipping on the evening of 4th of March and again in areas around the Mill and Zizzy's on the 11th of March. As you've heard from the family, there are, of course, other possibilities, such as that somebody else recovered the bottle and then discarded it themselves. But we say that the most likely possibility is that he had had it for some time. Perhaps most importantly, the absence of reliable evidence as to where and when Mr. Rowley found the bottle doesn't undermine the safety of a finding that the bottle he did find and took into Muggleton Road is the same one that was used at the Skripals' front door. Commander Murphy's view was that it's almost certainly the same bottle, and although MK26 was less confident, they made clear that their view was based on the scientific evidence only.
Yeah.
Firstly, as to that scientific evidence, as a result of detailed analytical work, we say you can safely conclude that the Novichok recovered from the door handle of the Skripal home at Christie Miller Road It's not just the same kind, but from the same batch as that recovered from the perfume bottle at Muggleton Road, being made in a single synthesis from the same precursor compounds at the same time.
Right.
And that's a key finding. Secondly, and in addition to the evidence that Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley were poisoned by the same Novichok from the same batch as that used against the Scripples, there's evidence which points to the bottle at Muggleton Road having been the container used to contaminate the door handle at 47 Christie Miller Road. You'll recall that Mr. Asman gave evidence that the Novichok was likely to have been sprayed onto the door handle. You'll also recall the pharmaceutical type applicator as it was designed that was found with a perfume bottle, and that was elongated, providing some protection to a user spraying the bottle's contents away from themselves, but sadly, of course, not to Miss Sturgess, who unwittingly used it to spray poison directly onto her skin.
Right.
The amount of empty space in the bottle at Muggleton Road was consistent with it having been used previously. It was also consistent specifically with the amount which might have been used at Christie Miller Road. The thick plastic pouch recovered from Muggleton Road, which was itself contaminated with Novichok, displayed forensic evidence that it had been sealed with two different heat-sealing devices, you'll recall, had two different textures on it. That's consistent with steps being taken after the attack on the Scripples to repackage the container in a way which would keep safe somebody who had to handle it. Those factors, we say, all point to the bottle recovered by Charlie Rowley being the same bottle that was used on the attack on the Scripples.
Right.
But of course, even if it wasn't the bottle used in that attack, that's a point the family have made, with which we'd respectfully agree, it still contained the same Novichok from the same batch that had been used at Christie Miller Road, and which can be linked to Bosharov and Petrov via the City Stay Hotel. Therefore, whether or not the inquiry finds that the container was the same one, in light of the scientific evidence, you can safely conclude that the assassins who carried the Novichok to attack the Scripples to Salisbury also carried and recklessly discarded the bottle containing the Novichok which killed Miss Sturgess. The only alternative would seem to be that there was a second unrelated team carrying Novichok around Salisbury on a distinct mission, and that's a hypothesis for which there's not a shred of evidence. As to what happened in Muggleton Road on the 30th of June, a clear picture has emerged from the results of the extensive testing and sampling. It's generally consistent with Mr. Rowley's account. A knife recovered from the kitchen work surface is likely to have been used by him to open the heat seal packaging. His account is that he did just this, and that he and Miss Sturgess then tried to assemble it, during which time he spilled it over his hands, which he then washed. He described how the device required assembly, and the presence of the orange cap of the bottle in the bin at Muggleton Road, itself contaminated with Novichok, adds forensic support to his account. Mr. Rowley described that he thinks Miss Sturgess put it on her wrists. That's supported by swabbing, which showed high levels of Novichok on both of her hands. And she also, in all likelihood, inhaled the Novichok by smelling her wrists in the mistaken belief that she just put perfume on them. That explains why she fell ill so much faster than Mr. Rowley and the Scripples. From that point, the effect of the medical evidence is that Dawn Sturgess's death was, sadly, inevitable. That's a reflection of the utter recklessness and callous disregard for public safety shown by those who were responsible for deploying and then discarding a lethal nerve agent on the streets of an English city. Those are our submissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Giovanetti. Very helpful. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. Am I right in understanding that I'm likely to hear from Mr. Berry for the Wiltshire Police, Ms. Dolan, Mr. Hoban, yes, and Ms. Wolfe? Yeah. And that's the full list, is it? Then we'll start at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.